Perhaps we could ask each of the panelists to provide a very brief, like maybe 1 minute, maybe 2 minute summary of the major points you would like to make sure that everybody takes away with them, and then we'll move into the questions. And maybe I'll just remind people to write your questions on a card, and Melinda and Trudy are collecting the cards, and we'll deal with them after the summary statements. Emily?
Thank you. I'll keep this brief. We know that schools are very safe places for children, and one very critical thing we must do is encourage our legislators to keep in place long-standing public safety protections that define schools and other sensitive places as being gun-free. We have opposition postcards in the back so people can help us to oppose Senate Bills 584 through 586 and ask their legislators to stand up for public safety to keep our children safe in schools.
I would like to add on to one thing that Emily is saying. This 584 is being sold to the public as a less disruptive way for our schools to conduct business. Currently, you can open carry a weapon in a public school, whether that's an assault weapon strapped down your body or slung across your front, or pistols showing. That is absolutely legal in Michigan today. In 584, we are supposed to be duped into thinking is going to be less disruptive because, the kids won't be frightened and we won't have to lock down the school and lose a day of education. It is the stance of the coalition that no guns in schools, period, end of discussion. Only trained law enforcement should be carrying guns in our public schools. We don't want them open carried, and we don't want them concealed carry. And there is legislation, actually, I believe it was Stephanie Chang that introduced it, that would add schools to the prohibited area for open carry. Could get that bill, 584 would be a moot point. So it is important that when you address your House of Representatives people to say something like that, we don't want guns in schools, period, only trained law enforcement. And there are a lot of scenarios with the school business that we all could think of what could go wrong. And we really need them to hear from us in opposition to 584. No guns, period. End of discussion.
Sonya?
I echo what Linda just said. And in the letter that I submitted, I made the point out of sight is not out of mind, and out of sight is certainly not out of danger. A gun is a gun, whether you can see it or whether you can't. I guess to summarize my remarks, I want to underscore that gun violence is a public health crisis, and to also emphasize the fact, much overlooked, that 2/3 of gun deaths are due to suicide, and dovetailing on that there are many things that one can do to prevent that from happening. One thing that I didn't have the opportunity to say, that I neglected to say, is that that gunshot wounds are reliably they work dependently. 90% of suicide attempts by gunshot are going to be successful. So the means are important. Other ways of suicide are certainly can lead to fatal results, but very often the victim has time to either reverse course or receive help or get transported to a hospital. Gun violence, not so much. So gun violence is a public health issue, and suicide is a major component of that.
Scott?
Yeah, so ERPO, ERPO, Extreme Risk Protection Order, current House Bill 4706 and 4707. We need a hearing and we need a vote on that bill. It is currently on the books in 5 states. It's currently been introduced in 19 others. And that for every 10 to 11 ERPO orders put into effect, 1 life is saved. Every suicide costs $1.3 million. That's $1.3 million.
In Michigan.
Linda?
Thank you. I want to steer you to two publications. I mean, I'm assuming that everyone is here because this is a very important issue to you. There is a source called the Gun Violence Archive, which is updated every single day. And I want to share a couple of numbers from that site that were current as of this morning. There have been 53,702 gun incidences in the United States today. There have been 13,544 gun deaths as of today. And those are only homicides or child deaths. Those are not suicides. There have been 645 children killed or injured. There have been 2,857 teens killed or injured. Now, remember what Sonya said, and that those numbers do not include suicides. And the reason for that is suicides are very difficult to tally. If you think about that, you don't read about a gun death by suicide in the paper the way, tomorrow some of our publications will be talking about those deaths in California. So the Gun Violence Archive is verified by two public postings of deaths. And we don't hear about suicides that way. Often they're not reported. People think, oh my gosh, the mass shootings, how many have there been? Well, as of today, there have been, probably before California, there were 317 mass shootings. A mass shooting, for purposes of research and tally, is 4 or more people shot in the same incident. So I don't know how they're going to talk about the problem from California today. We had to find special nomenclature for Kalamazoo when that happened 2 years ago. That was determined to be a mass shooting spree because it happened in several different locations, which I understand is the same thing from today. Most mass shootings are not 26 or 27 or 49 people shot at one time. It's a familial situation. Ordinarily, it's a man shooting his spouse and the children and killing himself. That's the most common type of mass shooting, and that then does account for many of these child victims that we've been talking about. Regarding activity for you to do after you brush your teeth tomorrow, I want you to call Rick Jones and say, I understand in your committee you have child access prevention legislation. It was introduced by Senator Warren in January. I want you to have a hearing on that. That kind of legislation will save children in Michigan. Thanks.
Thank you. I do have some questions here. Some of them sort of fall nicely into one person's bailiwick, if you will. I'd like to start with maybe, there's a question here for Sonya. What was the reason that the lawmaker gave when he introduced the bill that prevented research on gun violence? Do you or anybody else on the panel know?
Well, I don't know that it's a logical reason, but the explanation is that federal funds shouldn't be designated to support gun control, which was construed as a political agenda and not, as I've been saying, a public health crisis. So that's the reason, the superficial reason. The more, if there's a better reason, I don't understand it.
Anybody else have? Nope. Okay.
The gun lobby agenda.
Yeah. Let's see, Scott, there are a couple of questions about ERPO. One is that ERPO relates to suicide threats. Is there any way for law enforcement to take arms from those who threaten others? such as those who have PPOs.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I probably carved out suicide too narrowly there. That's harm to others as well. So currently, you have either committal or non-committal. You have voluntary committal, where you can, if someone's talking about harming themselves or others, you can ask for a voluntary committal. A lot of times as a law enforcement officer, that's what I would do. We would talk to the family, we would talk to the individual, and try to voluntarily to get them sign themselves into maybe a mental health facility. Then there's also non-voluntary. Those are people that we would basically lodge, like taking someone to jail, but we take them to St. Lawrence. We would place them in custody, and then the very next morning we would have a hearing. We'd have a civil hearing. So it's not a criminal process, but it's a civil process. The problem comes down to, though, is then what do you do with a voluntary committal then? So say my 30-year-old son, I get a call from my daughter-in-law, and says that, you know, he's talking about harming himself. He's depressed or whatever issue there could be. He voluntarily commits himself. Then how do I go into my 30-year-old son's home and get those firearms? Maybe he's not local, like I'm lucky to have my son living local. Maybe he's in California, and I'm dealing long distance, and I'm calling another agency. How do I get those firearms out of the home? So that's what this ERPO is. It's a tool, basically, for law enforcement. It's a tool for immediate family members when someone is threatening others, threatening themselves, a civil action to have those firearms seized temporarily.
Sort of a follow-up on that is, do you think that, and maybe other people might want to say anything about this too, would ERPO have perhaps made a difference in the situation at Sutherland Springs?
Well, I haven't been following it enough. I don't know exactly what comments were made. I know that he had a domestic violence conviction that was not entered. So there are laws in place, and in this situation, the laws weren't followed. So we have to have a lot of safety nets. It can't just be one that we rely on every single time. So again, there was a conviction through, I believe, the Air Force. It should have been entered. It was not entered. However, if we had these other safety nets, these stopgap measures, then we can probably, hopefully, prevent some of these tragedies. And again, rely on the science. Science says, 19 years of data out of Connecticut says that for every 10 to 11 weapons seized, suicide is prevented. So you're looking at, again, $1.3 million a loss that we prevent. So we have the data there.
Thanks, Scott. Linda, I think this is for you, or whoever. What is the status of assessing liability on gun manufacturers and sellers? Anything happening in Michigan?
Nothing is happening in Michigan. I believe I read this week that the bump stock stuff, it does not fall within the PLECA law. That's a special law that protects gun manufacturers from lawsuits. Again, a gun lobby funded, pushed kind of law. You know, we used to get little Easter candies, and they had some little toy inside and it was chocolate covered or whatever. Those are against the law. Because they were causing harm to children. And the gun manufacturers, it's the only manufacturing sector that is protected from a lawsuit. So an example was, I think it was Strom Ruger, they found a rifle that kind of went off by itself, was standing in the corner having to do with heat fluctuations. And that company could not be held accountable for injuries due to that gun because of this PLECA law. Probably one of the most common cases that you might be familiar with is after the Aurora shooting, Lucky Gunner was sued by parents who lost their child in the Aurora shooting. And that law was thrown out because of PLECA, and actually the NRA lawyers that were defending Lucky Gunner in the suit, their $250,000 bill was assigned to the Phillips because of the PLECA law. So, you know, I'm not certain when that came into effect. Maybe someone else knows. But really,
Anybody else want to add anything to it? No, okay. There's another question about how many other countries assume the right to own as many firearms and whatever kind people want.
None of our peer nations that are matched in terms of our political system or wealth have the kind of gun laws and gun availability, and subsequently the rates of gun death that we have in the United States. 0.
And you look at data right now, in America, we own 40% of all firearms around the world. So 40% of all firearms produced are here in our country.
Thanks, that's an amazing statistic. Sonya, there's a question I think falls into your bailiwick. Why do more males attempt suicide than females? And why are they more successful, if they are?
Sure. Well, actually, the data shows actually more females attempt suicide than males. Males are more successful, and the reason is that they tend to use firearms to a greater extent than females do. Why that is, I'm not sure. It might be a lecture on the psychology of men and women, but the statistics show that men tend to use firearms to a greater extent than women.
access.
Another thing that's of interest to me is the gun lobby has been making efforts to market guns to women and sort of branding it as a self-protection effort. Keep this gun by your bedside and you won't be raped, which we know is a total fallacy. But I was kind of thinking about this today, and it seems to me it's actually a project to create more suicide amongst women. So I don't know, take that for what it is.
The other thing about suicide relative to gun violence is that we know that only 3 to 6% of people who attempt suicide by other means try again. And the reason is that they get into treatment and then they learn there's light at the end of the tunnel. If you attempt suicide by gun, there are very few second chances.
Not to get too far off topic here, but just to build on what Sonya was talking about with the marketing towards women. Right now, there's a bill in our legislature. They want to lower the concealed pistol license age from 21 to 18. And their rationale behind that is that women are being sexually assaulted in college. Therefore, they need to have a concealed pistol in college at 18. So that's the rationale they use. They twist these lessons around, and they look at anything that will get traction. But that bill is pending right now.
Scott,
That
do you
bill
have,
passed the Senate last week. Yeah.
so does anybody have a bill number?
That's Senate Bill 366.
366, okay, thank you. This one, I don't know if anybody's going to have the answer to this. What percentage of gun deaths are from mass shootings?
I think it's around 8. I might be wrong about this, but the vast majority of gun deaths, as we know, 2/3 are suicide, most of it are homicide, are not in mass shootings, and the vast majority of mass shootings are not these ones, as Linda referred to, the very large numbers that are in public spaces. They tend to be people killing others that they know in their residences or their places of work. Most of them occur in places where people have guns. In fact, a very small percent of mass shootings occur in what are called gun-free zones. That's actually one of the rationales that was offered by the proponents of the bill I brought up today as to why people need to be armed in schools and sensitive spaces, that it would prevent mass shootings, when in fact only 13% of mass shootings occur in places that are commonly considered gun-free. They mostly occur in places where people can in fact and do carry guns.
Okay. This is sort of a follow-up for whoever wants to address it, and that's who pays for medical care and funerals for gun violence victims, and domestic violence survivors.
You, and you, and you, and you, and you.
Into
and
the
you,
microphone, please, Linda.
And you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. Somebody had the numbers here of the horrendous financial cost. Not only is there the cost around the funeral and all of that piece, but the thing that doesn't get factored into this question is the huge amount of money, bazillions of dollars, that an injured person has for the rest of their life, confined to a wheelchair, needing full-time care. All of that kind of thing, and of course then ultimately, even if they're a person with means, ultimately that runs out, and then it's Medicaid and, public dollars. So sometimes I wonder if some of the people that are perpetrating some of the legislation that we're talking about tonight would listen to a physical discussion of what happens around gun violence. It costs us a lot of money.
I do not want to add a little bit about the Las Vegas shooting, that there's been quite a bit of activity, at least on my Facebook feed, about the fact that people who were wounded in that shooting, that mass shooting, are having a terrible time paying for their hospital bills, and they just, they don't have resources to do it. This is sort of an interesting question. Why are there so many bills in state legislature pending for concealed right to carry? Several of you have sort of referenced this in your
Because this is the
presentations.
#1 NRA and gun lobby priority across the nation. If people can carry their guns with fewer questions in more places, more readily, it becomes a more attractive thing to own, as opposed to when there are more questions asked and there are more protections in place about where and whom can carry those weapons. It's a nationwide priority at the federal level that the gun lobby is pushing a federal bill that would force every state in the United States to recognize concealed carry permits from other states, which would set the bar as low as possible, which means that even states that have strong public safety protections would have to accept concealed carry permits from persons who've obtained those in states that have absolutely no oversight over whom can obtain those. That means no training, no restrictions or prohibitions on domestic abusers, people with dangerous histories obtaining those concealed carry permits.
Yeah, I'd say that's the holy grail right now for them. They want this. So then all they have to do is affect the legislation in, say, Louisiana or Mississippi. And then once they do that, then they have Michigan. They don't have to worry about it anymore. This fight for them is incredibly expensive. You go state to state to state, it is very expensive. So if you can just go to one state, pass that bill, that's what you want. You really want that. It's really easy to do. What I try to do is compare this, because I've been in law enforcement for so long, is I compare this to the financial deregulation, right? We had this financial deregulation that happened. It caused the crisis. Everyone pretty much is aware of that and agrees to that, of the financial meltdown in 2007. Well, this is what's going on. There's this deregulation that has been happening over the last couple decades. And what they're doing is they're systematically dismantling what I always say, the customs and laws of our parents and grandparents, and all those legislators that put those laws and bills into effect. And that's what's happening. It's a massive amount of deregulation that's happening.
Anybody else want to say anything about that? No? Scott, this is a question specifically, I think, for you, as far as are law enforcement officers in danger during domestic assault more than other situations?
Well, I don't know what more situations are. I mean, they're very touch and go, the domestic violence situations. And again, once, I had an officer tell me, he said, I know in every situation I go to, there's going to be at least one gun, and it's going to be mine, because I'm introducing that gun into the situation by being there myself. So when you look at the United States as owning 40% of the world's guns, now I think maybe in the 60s or 70s, if I showed up to a domestic violence situation, there'd probably be, an off chance that there'd be a firearm in the house. Now, when you look at the amount of guns that have been produced and sold and marketed by the gun lobby to Americans, there's a likely chance now that there is going to be a gun in that situation. Whether or not it's more dangerous, I don't know. My law enforcement career was very safe. I retired out of Flint, and a lot of people say, and I worked what we call the inner city detail. So I worked just in Flint on midnights for my last few years there. But I found it incredibly safe where I was at. And these, again, like our other panelists have said, these are crimes often committed against other people by the people they know. They're really not committed against law enforcement. A few of the officers that I served with over there had been involved in shootings, but we responded mostly to shootings that were a domestic situation.
We do actually know if you compare states that have stronger public safety protections with regard to their gun laws versus those that do not, that you see lower rates of death of law enforcement officers in those states in which we have stronger public safety protections in terms of gun policy. So it's not specifically talking about individual cases, but it's another example wherein we know that gun policies and gun laws actually work.
Yeah, and what Emily said is absolutely right in terms of law enforcement, but it is also right in terms of suicide and homicide. The stronger the gun laws in a particular state, the lower the death from guns. I mean, you can't say it's a cause and effect, but you can certainly say it's highly correlated. New York, for instance, had very good gun laws. Their rate per 100,000 is much lower. Alaska, not so much. High rate. So there's a definite correlation between the strength of a state's gun laws and the deaths by gun.
Hey, this comes down to the political process. My state representative and senator vote favorably for anti-gun laws. Should I still reach out to them? Is it okay to contact lawmakers even if I don't live in their districts? We've had some legislators who have essentially said, if you're not in my district, don't call me. It's, don't email me, you're not a constituent. Can people sort of talk a little bit about how do you deal with that? All the way from, brush your teeth and call, to how do you interact with a staff person who answers the phone and asks you, where do you live? And says, well, you're not in our district. I think you should call so-and-so. Do you have any tips for people on how to deal with that on a practical level?
Absolutely, you should call, regardless of where you think your legislator is, because it is a strength to them when they can go to the floor of either the House or the Senate and say, I have heard from 150 of my constituents today, and I am voting the way they instruct me to vote, and I am voting against 584, for instance. So they need that backing. The other thing in terms of our legislators is not only do we call them and tell them what we would urge them to do, but when they do it, call them and thank them. Take note. Some of these legislators are really out there and really are being courageous with their votes. And that certainly was the case in the Senate hearing earlier this week. So both, tell them what you want, and then when they do it, thank them. And if I call and or write to a member of the judiciary, for instance, no one in my particular district is on the judiciary committee, and the legislator and the staffer might say, well, where do you live? And I say East Lansing, and they say, well, that's not his district. I quickly say, I am calling because he is, or she, I think they're all he's on the Judiciary Committee, the committee is a state committee. And as a member of that state committee, they are working for everyone in the state, or they should be. So I'm calling them as a member of this Judiciary Committee to say, have a hearing on the extreme risk protection order. Have a hearing on child access prevention. That's their job as committee members. And as committee members, they work for everyone in the state.